Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the final segment of Finding Me on the Itv Networks. And before we went on to the break, we had raised some very pertinent issues, and I think, Joel, you would like to continue with that particular discussion.
Yeah, just following on what Yaku was talking about, the decolonization of knowledge, in relation now to the Constitution. There are really two ways. Professor Ramosi would say that we had two choices post 1994, democratization or decolonization.
Yes.
We chose democratization, the institution of liberal democracy in South Africa, and we presumed that the problems of coloniality and racism were over. Whereas decolonization is about undoing and reversing colonial relations of power. So decolonization, it really goes back to this notion of transformation. For me, transformation means decolonization. It's changing the very order of things, not simply making them better. Changing the order of things, not simply allowing more people in, but changing the way in which people are allowed in and out, right? So a strong argument is now emerging in which post-1994 there was just a strong fervor around the Constitution. The Constitution was seen as the best thing in the world. In fact, globally we are seen as the best constitution in the world, the most progressive constitution in the world. Of course, that's a claim you can only make when you deny the experiences of those for whom that constitution is, to be blunt, meaningless. So the claim has been that, in fact, the Constitution, rather than undoing colonial power relation, has in fact entrenched it, so that the Constitution is what keeps white power alive rather than what ends it. So that it's not even true to say the Constitution combats racism at all. In fact, it consolidates it, it reconfigures it, and it protects it. Not simply through the private property clause, but through maintaining a legal system that is patently colonial, whose epistemological paradigm is inherently Western, Eurocentric and modernist, to the exclusion of Africanist concepts. Professor Ramos made the point about how African customary law is anyway subordinated to the common law. And the common law is simply the Roman Dutch law, which was not received but imposed through colonial domination. So I think that we should call it the colonial law. So there's a strong argument now that the Constitution needs to be rethought, and that constitutional supremacy as an idea also needs to be rethought, because all it's about, constitutional supremacy, it's an aversion to black rule on an African continent.
So certain members of the ANC said that we need to revisit the Constitution, or that there's the whole idea of contestation of the Constitution. Why the shift from parliamentary superiority or supremacy to constitutional supremacy? There are issues that need to still be addressed, isn't it?
Certainly. I think it also has to do with the idea that it was a staggering move to have had South Africa pre-1994 always have constitutions that were not supreme to parliament. But under the real imminent possibility that a majority black government would be in power to ensure that there would be a constitution that is over them, so that their power really is always subject to the constitution. And if we understand the constitution to be so Western and always to Western power, to already those entrenched system of white privilege and white power. So that's the very clear concern.
How do you understand then the concept of minority majority then?
Well, we have this idea of counter-majoritarian rule. And there's the idea that the majority can have power in parliament, but there's a system in this country of the constitution that allows the minority, so counter-majority, so the minority, which in this country is understood as white people, to have other avenues outside of the desires or outside of the structures of the majority. But the problem with that delineation of majority, minority, the majority being black, minority being white, is that it's only a mathematical fact. It's not numerical. It's a statistical fact. But when we're looking at power relations, when you look at the arrangement of the economy, when we look at the general social and political power of white people, certainly they are in the majority. So I think we might have to reconceptualize and move away from essentialist understanding of words like majority and minority, and understand them in terms of power, in terms of privilege, of mobility, and so on. And if we understand it through that lens, then certainly white people in South Africa are the majority.
Okay. So if you consider that also, and if you look at the latest ruling, the court ruling about Barnard versus the SAPS, and solidarity, and this whole issue about them wanting to now take South Africa to International Criminal Court or to the UN or something to challenge this whole notion, to say that South Africa is reinforcing racism, etc. How do you then understand this ruling?
So that ruling is really consistent with the South African Constitution. Unlike in the United States, affirmative action is part of the right to equality, not an exception to it. One thing that's really interesting about South African equality jurisprudence is affirmative action cases in South Africa have developed through whites as claimants.
Okay.
So the problem with our affirmative action jurisprudence is it's still too defensive. It's about saying, no, this was okay to allow black people to be hired, or, the policy was justifiable. We're not yet seeing claims for affirmative action by black people.
Okay.
So that's the first thing. So it's maybe linked to issues of access to justice. But the Barnard case was linked to an ongoing case of a lady who was not given a job, who was not promoted to superintendent in the police service, despite receiving the highest scores.
And merit.
So she was relying on the notion of merit and presuming that focusing on her race and not her merit actually perpetuates divisions and goes against the Constitution's notion of non-racialism. That's highly problematic, firstly because merit is always influenced by power. And I think you can say a bit more about that. But also because what I often worry about people who claim that affirmative action is about the misuse of racial categories is that it really distorts our history. It makes it appear as if our history is a history of the use of racial categories. So the problem of apartheid was racial categories, not racial domination. And that's not the case. The problem in this country is white domination and racial oppression, not racial categories or racial names. Because otherwise, like the DA really does, is all you're doing is you're objecting to a label or a name, not a condition or an issue.
And I think that's what is important for us, at least. I think it's important for the EFF, but also important for the Anti-Racist Forum, a movement in the University of Pretoria, specifically concerned with racism, doing anti-racist work, but of course always understanding the notion of racism as linked to other systems of domination, heterosexism, capitalism, patriarchy, and so on. So if we go back to definitional conceptual clarifications and we understand our definition of racism as always, or any power system of power as always a structural system, then it really will help a lot to dampen these ideas of reverse racism, of BEE as being a domination of black people over white people and so on. Because if we understand the structural, it won't be about the personal, it won't be about merit, and even if it was merit will always be understood as impregnated by ideas of power, of privilege, of history, of economic mobility. So I think we can go a long way, at least through conceptual clarification, already set up a definition that inherently responds automatically to such bizarre notions such as reverse racism,
reverse apartheid.
And reverse apartheid, which is just a bizarre thing. Almost like apartheid was bad because whites were crude or rude to black people.
And now black people
there was a whole system, there was a structure that existed that made that crudeness have power. I mean, if somebody's rude to you, you can ignore them. But there's something about the inability to ignore racism because its crudeness is laced with power. It has meaning, and its meaning, it has meaning, and its meaning is definitely a tyrannical meaning. It's psychic at the level of its real implications and so on. So
while you're speaking about that, and I was just thinking about the EFF and perhaps how the EFF has been perceived or has been portrayed by mainstream Western media and even the opposition political parties. So in that way, let's just clarify quickly, seeing that I've never had an EFF spokesperson on board, although I'm waiting for Mbizeni to respond to me. So he promised we'll talk at some point, maybe when he's out of parliament. The question about land, for example, so I have two questions for you. Let me just put them straight. What is the EFF's policy on land? And secondly, why should Muslims vote for the EFF? What is the EFF's policy and what can they do for the Muslim community? And secondly, the EFF stand on Israel and Palestine.
Okay, I'm going to start with why Muslim people need to vote for the EFF. It's the same question that was given to the EFF Takshirin Command team from the Muslim Student Association when we successfully succeeded in breaking the MSA and the PSC away from the Progressive Youth Alliance to join us. And my answer to them would probably be the same, because the EFF has a radical alternative to offer. We cannot rely on other liberal mediocratic scenarios, how to solve problems, policy, this, conference, this. It won't do good. To us, I always feel that a radical alternative is what we can grant.
So it's action.
I believe that the EFF can drive this whole idea of the Palestinian solidarity in South Africa further, more radical, more effective, and we can raise that voice even further. With regards to why Muslim people need to vote as well, is because at least we as the EFF see Muslim people as black people. There's no difference between them and a black person, if you want to call it that. They are part of the margins, of the periphery, racially speaking, and historically. I guess alone we can refer that Muslim people were seen no different than black people by white eyes. And today it's kind of the same. The question with regards to the EFF's anti-capitalist notion and that we are going to turn South Africa into Zimbabwe and just take land, to me is a very dangerous assumption to make. So there's alternatives that are offered by the EFF, but that does not necessarily mean that it's going to return in Zimbabwe. The EFF has never ever said that the plans we have are similar to that of Zimbabwe's. Nor have they ever said that this is going to be a procedure that we will just grab everybody and chuck them off the land.
Okay, but we're almost at the end, so if you want to perhaps give us a parting comment. And I just want to clarify one viewpoint, however, that the EFF also understands the Muslim viewpoint that Israel-Palestine is not a religious issue, that it is about land, it's about theft and colonization.
Yes. It's about land, and if you link it directly to the EFF's views, it's about taking the land from private ownership and put it in the custodianship of the state.
Yes.
The state then distributes the land amongst the people.
The privileged here.
And you have to apply to use this land. It's a more, in my opinion, sustainable way of farming, because the current way the farming is working, it's not sustainable. It's not friendly to the economy, and it's not friendly to the ecology. So to me, it's a new alternative way of farming that brings everything back to land in general is important for black people.
I know we have to go, but I quickly want to say it's also not just an economic endeavor. It's not just about let's make black rich by giving them access to the economy. It's also about recognition of the inherent dignity and a return of the culture of people. Because land, at least in the African, in the black sense, has never just been a commodity for which one can produce money. It has also spiritual and cultural connections. It's often the site of ancestral burial. It's often the site of community sharing of territory and so on. And so the distribution of land must not be reduced to this kind of profit generating, quantifiable. How does it appreciate profit and so on? It mustn't reduce it to that. There's a real underlying value and appreciation of the worth of a culture, of a people, of the historical fact that the land was taken through vicious forms from them, and so we have to understand Eclipse land in that much broader term, not just about economic and money.
But with that, I have to say thank you very much for being here and for sharing these viewpoints. And of course, let's leave it on that final reminder that we have to consider the dignity of the African people.
Restore the land, restore the dignity.
Restore the dignity. So thank you very much, Joel, Alfred, and Yaku. Fi amanillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.